In theoretical terms, I sense a great affinity between the analysis you and Edward S. Herman present in Manufacturing Consent and the dissident cultural research engaged in by Western Marxists during the 20th century. You are famously given to quoting Antonio Gramsci saying, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." I would like to ask whether you believe the US populace to be too conservative, distracted, and enthralled by the system to move radically against it. Do you think the public will become the second superpower you hope for in hegemony or survival?
Well, I'm not sure the public is that conservative, frankly. There are some interesting indications to the contrary. So, for example, in 1976, the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, there were polls taken in which people were asked what they thought was in the Constitution. And nobody has a clue what's in the Constitution. But the answers basically were, do you think this is an obvious truth? If it is, it's probably in the Constitution. One of the questions was to each, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. The majority of the population thought that was in the Constitution, because it's obviously true. In the late 1980s, there were polls taken asking people, do you think that a right to health care is in the Constitution? A very large proportion, I think maybe a majority of the population thought it's in the Constitution. If you take a look at the polls generally, you find that even among sectors of the population that are considered very right-wing, you do studies of people who say, get the government off my back, I don't want the government. They turn out to be social democrats. They want more spending on health, more spending on education, more spending on, say, mothers with dependent children, but not welfare, because welfare was demonized by racists, Reagan and others. And this runs across the board, even on international affairs. So a majority of the population thinks that the U.S. ought to give up the veto at the Security Council and follow what the world population believes is right. You take a look at taxes, it's striking. There have been polls on taxes for about 40 years. And overwhelmingly, the population thinks the rich should be taxed more, they're undertaxed. Policy goes the opposite direction. Polls are not definitive. I mean, you have to inquire into why people are answering the way they do. There could be lots of reasons, but they're not insignificant either. My own feeling is that people like Adam Smith were basically right, that there is a natural sympathy for others. And I think the rich and powerful understand that. I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a massive effort to destroy the institutions in the society that are based on solidarity. So, for example, why is the right wing, and in fact not just the right wing, goes over to Obama, so intent on undermining Social Security? It costs nothing, essentially. It's a very efficient program. The people survive on it. It works very well. There's no economic problems that couldn't be tinkered with. It's really marginal. But there's a major effort to destroy it. Why? It's based on solidarity. It's based on concern for others. There's a major attack on the public schools. Deep underfunding, vouchers, all kinds of things. Foundations are trying to undermine them. Why? Public schools are a major contribution to modern society. They're one of the real contributions of American society, mass public education. Why destroy them? Well, they're based on solidarity. If you take the ideology that we're supposed to believe in, why should I pay taxes for the schools in my neighborhood? I don't have kids in school, I don't have grandchildren in school, I never will. Why should I pay taxes? Well, if you pay taxes so that the kid across the street will go to school, because you care about other people. But that has to be driven out of people's heads. It's a little bit like markets and consumption. Markets are favored by the economics profession, by the rich, and so on, up to a point. They really don't believe in them. They want the state, powerful state, to come in and save them if they're in trouble. But ideologically, they're preferred. because they restrict human action to individual self-gratification, not mutual support, not protection of the commons. Actually, the commons are an interesting case. We're coming up to the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Magna Carta had two parts. One part was the Charter of Liberties. The central part was presumption of innocence. That's out the window. Okay, that's, you know, by now, the guilty means Obama wants to kill you tomorrow. That's the definition of guilty. Innocent means he didn't get around to it yet. But the other part of the Magna Carta was the Charter of the Forests. That's the part that's kind of, you find in the popular myth, like the Robin Hood myths. Robin Hood was protecting the commons from the predators. That's a big part of our history, English history. The commons were cultivated by the general population. The commons were the forests, the fields, the source of fuel, food, welfare. Widows would pick things from the forest to survive, and it was nurtured. It was nurtured by the public. It was cared for. They weren't let grow into jungles. They were carefully cared for. The Charter of Forests was an effort, not by the population, by the barons, to protect the commons from the king. But the population wanted to protect the commons for themselves. Then you move into the capitalist period, beginning with the enclosure movements, which drove people off the land and so on. And you have a destruction of the commons. Today, in the capitalist ethic, there's a concept called the tragedy of the commons, which you study in economics, which teaches you that if you don't have private ownership of the commons, it's going to be destroyed. Well, based on capitalist morality, that's true. If I don't own it, what should I try to preserve it? But in ordinary human life, that's just totally false. Privatization is the tragedy of the commons. We can see that, in fact. When you privatize the commons, it gets destroyed for private profit. If the commons are kept under common control, they're cultivated and nurtured, because people care about each other. They care about the future. Well, okay, I think these are very different. When you ask, is the population conservative? I doubt it. I think that these are deeply rooted sentiments and understandings which show up all the time. They showed up in labor struggles against the industrial system, which was dehumanizing people. In peasant societies, they show up. The indigenous societies today struggling against, say, gold mines. Maybe it'll give them more material wealth, but it'll destroy their lives. You find this everywhere. And in the great thinkers of the past, the people we are supposed to admire, like Adam Smith, it's his central doctrine.